Above all, we shall need clear minds, honest minds, courageous minds, well-informed minds, in a word, educated minds. For the simple and unpalatable truth is that our democratic system cannot continue if its motive power is to be a mixture of class selfishness, materialism, disregard of minorities, and a somewhat lazy indifference to the future. This powerful statement on the value of education is found in Robert Menzies' 1943 book, The Forgotten People. He recognised that creating self-reliant yet community-minded individuals in the complex post-war world required a renewed emphasis on education. Menzies was able to achieve much in the field of education during his second term as Prime Minister. Some of this achievement, such as the expansion of universities, can be related to his commitment to liberalism and the ideal of the community-minded, free-thinking individual. However, especially in the period between 1961 and 1966, Menzies' educational liberalism in policy and practice shows a number of contradictions. On the one hand, he advocated a form of mass education for enlightened citizenship at primary and secondary level. Yet on the other, Menzies wanted to keep the universities as an elite system, coping with the increased growth in qualified school leavers by creating colleges of advanced education with less status than universities. This paper will explore the continuities and discontinuities of Australian education during Menzies' second term in office, and also the extent to which they reflect Menzies and his government's ideals of liberal education. With the assistance of hard-won scholarships and prizes, Menzies enjoyed the benefits of a private secondary education and a first-class honours degree at Melbourne University. Consequently, as a lawyer and politician, Menzies had great faith in the capacity of Australia's formal education system to produce enterprising and civic-minded individuals. Menzies had three principal ideas relating to liberalism as it applied to education. In the first place, Menzies was a firm believer in mass education as a means of improving the capacity of individuals to prosper in a modern society. Because of the need to maintain standards of living in an era of increasing population growth and technological change, Menzies argued that more and more individuals had to be educated to a high level to contribute effectively as citizens and workers. He also asserted that individuals capable of academic success at the highest level should not be prevented from doing so through lack of funds. Despite regarding higher education as restricted to men and women of obvious talent, Menzies saw the university system as subtly promoting the ideal of mass education, and I quote, "The social, scientific, economic and industrial complexities of Australia today are largely beyond the imagination of 40 years ago. Great skill achieved after higher training is no longer to be admired in a few. We must, on a broad basis, become a more and more educated democracy if we are to raise our spiritual, intellectual and material living standards. Viewed in this way, our universities are to be regarded not as a home of privilege for a few, but as something essential to the lives of millions of people who may never enter their doors." End quote. The second major liberal policy principle in education which Menzies pursued was a firm philosophical commitment to a broad rather than strictly vocational education for Australians, insisting that the notion that education is a preparation for a living and not for a life is altogether too prevalent. He was personally disturbed by the notion of children and young adults gaining specialist knowledge of a narrow range of subjects without gaining a wider understanding of Western society and its values. And I quote, "A scientist who was unaware of literature and history or of the principles of social responsibility would be dangerous. A humanist who turned his back on the discoveries in natural science, who did not know something of their impact upon life and living, would be condemning himself to a socially fruitless life." End quote. Menzies' third and final conception of the role of liberalism in education was his belief that the first and foremost purpose of formal education was to provide the individual with a broad ethical framework and a sense of proportion and balance. In Menzies' worldview, the development of educational and vocational knowledge could not be separated from the development of character. And I quote, "The first function of education is to produce a good man and a good citizen. Its second function is to produce a good carpenter or a good lawyer, and the good carpenter and good lawyer will all be the better at their respective crafts if they have become aware of the problems of the world and have developed that comparative sense that produces detachment of judgment and tend always to moderate passion and prejudice." End quote. So much for the rhetoric. So what of the reality? To what extent did Menzies' fine-sounding words translate into policy and action during the 1950s and 60s? Sir Robert Menzies' greatest contribution to education was in the tertiary sector. He saw universities as the training ground for Australia's future leaders, professionals and public servants. He also believed that the discipline of research at the university level taught the students values which assisted with long-term professional decision-making, such as patience, objectivity, balance and detachment. Through training the elite individual in pure as opposed to just practical learning, Menzies argued that the universities were fighting a rearguard action against the growing materialism of Western society. And I quote, "Are the universities mere technical schools, or have they as one of their functions the preservation of pure learning, bringing in its train not merely riches for the imagination, but a comparative sense for the mind, and leading to what we need so badly, the recognition of values which are other than pecuniary?" Menzies' post-war university reforms built upon the work begun by the Curtin and Chifley Labor governments during the 1940s. Labor's major education initiatives included the establishment of the Australian National University and the Commonwealth Reconstruction Training Scheme, which provided funds for the training of ex-servicemen and women. Before World War II, the Commonwealth spent very little on education, which was constitutionally a state concern. By 1942, however, the states agreed to give up the right to collect income tax, giving the Commonwealth a monopoly on annual income tax collection. This was a temporary war measure which became permanent by default. The new tax arrangements emboldened the Commonwealth to incrementally play a larger national role in education, especially within the tertiary sector. Largely because of the imminent conclusion of the Commonwealth Reconstruction Training Scheme and the increased demands for a university education, Menzies in 1951 introduced a Commonwealth University Scholarship Scheme, as well as assistance to the states for universities. Menzies' legislation conformed to his liberal ideals. The Prime Minister did not attempt to use the Commonwealth's increased powers to force universities to adopt particular principles or emphases. Prior to the 1951 legislation, Menzies told representatives of the Vice-Chancellor's Committee that the British tradition of autonomy in the universities must be preserved at all costs. Freedom to expend their funds as they saw fit should be at the absolute discretion of the governing bodies." End quote. However, the Commonwealth's new subsidies did little to substantially ease the university's infrastructure problems, such as overcrowded lecture halls and limited capacity for research. Until 1956, Menzies' response to lobbying by universities and the states for more Commonwealth tertiary funds was muted. He may, of course, have been preoccupied with other government and political priorities. He may also have been ambivalent about increasing the Commonwealth's financial stake in the university sector. Whatever the case, by the late 1950s, the Menzies government had adopted a more generous attitude towards funding higher education, accepting recommendations from a specially commissioned report on Australian universities by Sir Keith Murray. In 1957, Menzies committed the Commonwealth to playing a large role in expanding the infrastructure, facilities and research of universities, including the provision for the first time of postgraduate scholarships. The Liberal government's increased funding enabled the number of students enrolled at Australian universities to rise from 53,338 to some 100,000 between 1960 and 1968. There can be little doubt that Menzies' liberal ideals influenced his ultimate generosity towards the university sector. As Sir Keith Murray later remembered, "I shall never forget Menzies' parting words. I have been almost 30 years in Australian politics. I have not found them very rewarding, but if I leave the Australian universities in a healthy state, it will all have been worthwhile." It was said with such a note of sincerity that I was convinced of his deep-seated devotion to the university's welfare and to scholarship in general. Still, despite his attachment to the ideal of the university as an agent of free thinking and civilisation, Menzies retained a belief that universities were for the elite, not financial elites, but academic elites who would make a contribution to public life. Menzies' last education, the Commonwealth's aid to secondary schools in the mid-60s emphasised the sciences but not the humanities. This was a reflection of the technical age that was emerging, in which unprecedented investment in science was leading to advances in agriculture, manufacturing and other drivers of prosperity. Still, in 1965, Menzies took care to frame his government's investment in secondary school science infrastructure as symbolic of educational liberalism, and I quote, "I went out to Bathurst the other day to open a science block at a school. These boys will be able to equip themselves to be pioneers of a new growth of knowledge." Bathurst, after all, was the new frontier itself, opened up by Blaxland and Wentworth. And I said to these boys, just as these great men had sought out new frontiers and discovered them, so they themselves would be the pioneers. We can all be pioneers, and the more talented we are, the more we can pioneer great movements, great things, great body of knowledge. End quote. Menzies' liberalism shows a number of contradictions. On the one hand, he advocated a form of mass education for enlightened citizenship at primary and secondary level, yet on the other, Menzies wanted to keep the universities as an elite system, coping with the increased growth in qualified school leavers by creating colleges of advanced education with less status than universities. Menzies strongly advocated the right of the individual to act freely and to build their own destiny, yet rewarded the individual who sent their child to a private school with tax deductions. Some choices were better than others. On the whole, though, Menzies' educational achievements are worth remembering and celebrating. As a political actor, Menzies often played a constitutional purist, reluctant to move into state matters such as education, but partly through political pressure and his own inclination, his role shifted towards a more nationally minded, if still financially cautious, sponsor of education reforms, which decisively changed public attitudes towards the funding of schools and tertiary education, paving the way for greater national investment in education during the Whitlam era and beyond. As John Gorton told his colleagues in 1966, regardless of constitutional niceties, the public want and expect a greater Commonwealth involvement in education. Finally, it's what Menzies didn't do as much as what he did that gave his liberal vision of education its strength of character. Menzies and his government did not seek to interfere with the administration and priorities of educational institutions. However, his funding of scholarships and support for infrastructure facilitated the educational achievements of young people. The growth of the universities in particular encouraged students from a diverse range of backgrounds, including regional and rural communities, to prosper and to be enriched by their learning of science, the arts, humanities and other subjects that interested them as individuals. Indeed, Menzies was proud to say that whenever I go around Australia and look at a university and see the great buildings rising to the sky, I take some pleasure in the fact that it is our government and our party that has produced these phenomenal results. Thank you.
Lyndon, how do you think Menzies would respond to the increasing corporatization of Australian universities, where vice chancellors now make 2 or 3 times the salary of the prime minister, where international students are treated as cash cows, and where so-called liberal education, such as in the arts and education, are increasingly marginalized?
Well, I think he'd probably be turning in his grave and then go back to reading Keats. I think that it's. I think that universities can probably look back to the Menzies year and take some lessons from it, and perhaps see the importance of some of those traditional values that Menzies was talking about. At the moment, universities are too busy with the next great craze, and they perhaps should be looking to find again their inner fuddy-duddy to a certain degree, because there are certain values that Menzies was talking about, particularly the importance of good citizenship, which need to have a greater emphasis in today's education. Although you can't generalise too much because there are so many different tertiary education institutions that it's difficult to generalise about the whole shebang.
Thanks, Lynn. That was great. I just want to make a little comment that might be interesting. When you take a liberal education, the Catholic system, when they were given the money for science blocks, were very wily. They would start the science blocks on the first floor, therein allowing them to have funding for a huge recreation area, hall, whatever, on the ground floor. So in a sense, they got money for science, but they got a very liberal donation to the other life of the school.
Yeah. Thank you.
How would Menzies react to the Chinese influence in Australian universities at the moment?
That's a question I really can't answer. It's a really dangerous question. I think I need to have a dignified silence on that one, I'm afraid. It's a good question, but I can't give you a good answer, unfortunately.
This has been a really fascinating session. Thank you to all contributors. And Lyndon, you're getting a couple of quite unfair questions. Here's another one. I mean, you emphasised the tension in Menzies' education policy. You ended by Gorton observing that the public expect more investment in education. The question that I'm coming around to is, there were so many pressures in the 1950s to properly resource education. They're at a state level with the Whitlam report in New South Wales. There are the international drivers. We know how housing policy coming out of the 1950s was changed by the Menzies government in the 1950s, 1960s. Christopher Beer might talk a bit about this tomorrow. But can you in any way hypothesise how might education policy have been different given the expectations that were being made of secondary and tertiary education if it hadn't been a Menzies government but another government that had been driving these reforms? To what extent were the reforms being driven by social change rather than by a distinctive political leadership?
I think that eventually it could have, in terms of counterfactuals, I think it could have been the issue that brought Labor into power for a short period there, particularly when Gorton was making his speech. He was making it to cabinet actually. There was a period where education was a real bubbling issue, and that's the 60s. And if Menzies hadn't acted, it may have been a force that Labor could have used to get into power. And we may, who knows, we might be looking back at the Corwell era.
This will have to be the last one.
If I could just follow on from that, to what extent was leadership relevant? It seems to me that if you look at 3 of the 4 sessions we've just had together, it suggests that maybe that's part of what the role of leadership is here. Because looking at what happened in schools, we've had one analysis that looks at state aid in terms of political opportunism. We've had another that looks at it from the perspective of science and the significance that science acquired and international developments, and the third, yours, talking about the liberal vision of education. And it seems to me that that's perhaps where I think all three of those analyses are interesting and important, and perhaps that's where the leadership of Menzies comes in, that he's someone that sees, that brings together those three things in a way that perhaps a different leader might not have seen the possibilities to bring them together in quite the same way.
Yeah, I mean, I think definitely, I think particularly Alan Martin's second volume of his biography of Robert Menzies shows that his leadership was vital to bringing the cabinet into supporting the recommendations of the Murray Committee. He was the one that was driving the show. In terms of other leaderships, I think, I mean, I emphasised a lot on Menzies' speech making, and you know, I got carried away with that last quote because I think it's a great quote about, you know, how knowledge and education can make us all pioneers and assist with our growth. And I think those kind of messages of support are really valued. I mean, this is a time, the 50s and 60s, where people were, in fact, attuned to the idea of a liberal education. If I go back to my own state of Queensland, they were planning to make what became James Cook University, which was then Townsville University College of the University of Queensland. They were going to say, okay, we'll just make this a science and engineering university. But then they said, hang on, we won't get enough numbers. So they had to bring in as original subjects in 1961, like French, geography, history, English, and so on. And it showed that there is support for this idea of a broad-based education. And the same with, in 1968, Micah Hearn was browbeating the UQ students for all choosing Bachelor of Arts over science. So it shows that there was a great, you know, wider interest in these liberal ideas of education. And it's probably more research to be done on that topic.
Apologies to George and whoever else might have questions, but we'll have to leave it there. Thank you, Lyndon.
Thank you.
We break now for afternoon tea, and then we reconvene at